Hello, welcome everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the second day of our conference on foundational renewal. My name is Bernd Bonfert. I'm a research associate here at WISERD, and I'll be chairing the session this morning on funding the foundational economy. For those of you who are joining us for the first time today, again, welcome. This conference is the third in a series of foundational economy events that we're organizing as WISERD and as the Foundational Economy Research Network. The previous ones were, I believe, in London, Brussels, and again, Cardiff, again online. But of course, we're hoping to return to having face-to-face events next time. And on that note, there will actually be a feedback form circulated at the end of the conference where you can actually include your preferences, where you would like the next conference to be. So do feel free to fill that out. As I said, the session today is all about, or this morning is all about funding the foundational economy, which I suppose is as much a practical question as it is a source of contestation. Because within our whole system of financialized capitalism, there's constant pressure to be profitable. There's constant pressure to be at least self-sustaining and competitive, even within the public and social sphere. And there are institutional pressures towards fiscal austerity, towards keeping taxation competitive, all of which prevents resources from being invested, for instance, into socially reproductive sectors. And these are conditions that, as a transformative foundational economy, we're looking into confronting and to ultimately overcome. And to discuss what that means and what alternatives can look like, we invited 4 brilliant speakers today, who are, in order of speaking, Tommaso Faccio from the University of Nottingham, Steve Jeffels from the University of Manchester, Anna Coote from the New Economics Foundation, and Professor Susan Himmelweit from the Open University and Women's Budget Group. And yeah, to start us off, I would like to introduce you to our first speaker, Tommaso Faccio. He's a lecturer in accounting at Nottingham University, and his work specializes on taxation. And he'll be talking to us about post-COVID, progressive taxation becomes a necessity, not a choice. So yeah, Tommaso, the floor is yours.
Hi, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Let me just okay. So first of all, thank you to the Institute for the invitation to speak at this conference on the Foundational Renewal Conference Transforming Reliance System in the wake of COVID-19. It's really a good opportunity and a very timely moment. Could not be more timely given the current debate that we have in England in particular on reforming social care. I see some of the audiences from England, some others are not, but just in the last week, there's been a high debate in the UK how to fund social care for the elderly, and this requires an answer in relation to progressive taxation. How are we going to fund it? What choices do we make around taxation to contribute to an economy that works for everybody, and where the tax system is actually subordinated to societal interest? The COVID-19 pandemic. So this is a debate that is live. Today we'll have this will be debated in the Parliament in London. But this is the backdrop: is the COVID-19 pandemic, and this has caused suffering, hardship to millions of people across the globe, and a deep, potentially long-lasting global economic crisis. And the pandemic has emerged on top of a world that's trying to fight climate crisis, which will require massive investment in cleaner economy and to support vulnerable affected economies. The pandemic has so far resulted in 4 million life deaths, and the toll continues to rise. More have suffered serious illnesses, and the pandemic has pushed more than 100 million people into extreme poverty. There is an apparent rebound in 2021, but this is also unequal, with some of the worst low-income countries being affected and actually in a worse situation compared to last year. And these combined crises have devastated the economies in many countries and presented the government with many challenges. At the same time, as the virus has spread, the central banks injected more than $9 trillion into the economy to keep the world economy afloat. Much of the stimulus has gone into financial markets, and this into the net worth of ultra rich. The total wealth of billionaires worldwide has risen from 5 trillion to 13 trillion in 12 months to April, and is continuing to rise. Much of it went into assets, particularly housing in many countries, and that has further increased inequality. So instead of being the great leveler, the pandemic has actually exacerbated inequality. Despite the scale of these challenges, though, the pandemic provides a unique and historical opportunity. So in most countries, unprecedented steps are taken to expand social assistance, and the case for social cohesion, proactive states, and global cooperation has never been clearer. In charting the way forward, governments are grappling to balance the pressure to cut taxes or increase tax incentive to protect key sectors of the economy against the medium-term necessity to increase government revenues. Whatever the balance in the short term, it is likely that in many countries, revenue will have to increase, and they need to do so in a way that is fair, so that costs also fall on the shoulders of those most able to bear them. And in this context, is progressive taxation becomes a necessity, not a choice. While the revenue must rise, those that have the biggest shoulder should bear the brunt of that rise. But this requires to move away from 50 years of tax cuts for the rich, trickle-down economics that has not delivered either employment or growth. We've been told time after time the cuts to corporation tax rates will have delivered growth and employment and better standard living for all, but instead it has delivered wealth inequality without increasing neither employment nor investment. But policymakers are finally understanding that there is no link between taxing corporates and investment decision. The earlier belief that taxes to corporate tax rate could spur investment has been contradicted by the reality. The corporate tax decreases have failed to provide a step change in investment. This is true in the UK, where the corporation tax rate was cut from 30% before the global financial crisis to the current rate of 19%. And the UK government is now planning to increase that rate to 25% from 2023. In India, where the base rate was cut from 30% to 22% in 2019, and the US, where the Trump administration cut the rate from 35% to 21%. In all cases, lower rates did not increase investment. And in the case of the US, most of the cut was actually used to fund dividend payments and stock buybacks. For years, they also told us the incidence of corporate taxation was on employees and customers, whilst in reality, there is no consensus on this. Everybody agrees in the short term an increase in taxes, in corporate taxes, will actually be paid by shareholders. And then there is a debate around the long term, but nobody really is clear on when the short term starts. Somebody says 10 years, but there isn't even consensus on that. This is why the US is currently planning to increase corporate taxation from 21% to 28% and capital gains tax rate for the wealthiest, 0.3% to the population, to 39.6%. And what they're going to use that money from, this is a large package of 3.5 trillion investment in childcare, family leave, public housing, and climate change provision, which will build a more cohesive and inclusive economy. COVID has provided, therefore, the perfect opportunity for a rethink, but this is going to be a fight. It's not going to be easy to just move to progressive taxation. In the war of ideas there's been fought, the two sides are not evenly matched. The task is tough, not least because of the barrage of corporate lobbying that weighs policymakers trying to make changes. Just in relation to the US proposal, corporate America spent $1.5 billion just in the first 6 months of the year to try to water these measures down. This is big banks, tech giants, pharmaceutical companies. On the other end, Labour spent $22 million. This is 1% of what corporate lobbying spent. So it is really a David versus Goliath fight. We see bogus reports being released to try and push back on these reforms. Just the other day, there was a Chamber of Commerce report saying that tax increases will lead to 5 million job losses in the US. last month there was a report by an accounting firm saying that tax increases will lead to 1 million of job losses. Neither consider the effect of investment on creating or more the money is going to be used to create jobs. But what's the truth? Is it 1 million? Is it 5 million? So, but these figures keep coming, trying to push back on reforms that will make the tax system more progressive. But despite the opposition, the tide is shifting towards more progressive policies. This is supported by the public, who as a result of the pandemic see a better role for the state and see that they've been helped during the pandemic. And people who have been directly hurt by the pandemic tend to be stronger advocates for the state support, and thus the public sentiment is shifting in favor of more progressive taxation. And the key to unlock the debate on taxation, answering the question who should meet the cost of funding a more inclusive foundational economy, must be fairness. And the general public understand what fairness means. We saw this in the last 48 hours, where in the UK, the Tory government used a plan to put forward a social care reform, which will be paid by national insurance contribution. But this, by an increase in national contribution, that is paid both by employees and employers, but it's not paid by somebody who, for example, gets income from renting a flat. And this was met by a backlash of critics, both on the regressive nature of the reform, but also on the generational impact, because national contributions are not paid by pensioners. And the government had to do a small U-turn. In the last 48 hours, they have to actually include a levy on dividends to actually make the reform a bit more progressive. Dividend income is highly concentrated in the top 1%, and therefore this makes ultimately the proposal more progressive. But this was as a result of a backlash just in the last 48 hours, which means that the publics really understand whether a reform it's deemed to be fair. So the public supported the increase in cost. There was before the announcement yesterday, there was a poll saying that most support an increase in taxes to pay for social care. Just after the announcement was made, there was another poll saying there's still a support, but their support diminished, probably because of the backlash of criticism. So after years of trickle-down economics, I think personally the tide is shifting, but the fight back will be fierce by those that benefited from the current system. And you can notice it on the front page of this newspaper, what they think about the increases in taxes. So they say, highest taxes in the world. They don't want higher taxes. If you look at the actual graph, they started from 1950. They didn't start from 1945 when the war actually ends, because between 1945 and 1950, there was higher taxes than what is actually the focus for the next few years, which tells you a lot about whether they like the reform or not. But the stakes are thus very high, but the opportunity to create a fairer society is here. It will take courage to deliver a society where we no longer have people bathing in unimaginable wealth, whilst others who work from dawn to dusk are struggling to make ends meet and have to actually use food banks. The pandemic is a test of solidarity, and meeting today's and tomorrow's challenges will require a system where everybody contributes their fair share towards a foundational economy, and this will require progressive taxation. I thank you for your time. Happy to answer questions in due course.
Right, thanks a lot, Tommaso. Very, very thought-provoking presentation. If you can stop sharing your presentation, shift to the next speaker. We can move to Steve Jeffels, who I heard just got his doctorate at the University of Manchester, so congrats. He'll be talking about higher taxes for the foundational economy, good news and bad.
Thank you, Bernd. Can you hear me and see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Bernd, for the introduction. I'll come on to my background in a bit more detail in a moment. But let me start with something of a spoiler alert, because this presentation, I think, contains what for some of you will be both good news and bad. The good news, I think, is that potentially some significant additional tax revenue is available, and I'll explain a little bit as to why it's available and where it might come from. But the bad news is, and I apologize if this has some sort of overtones of the climate crisis, that really there are some inconvenient truths. Foundational provision is likely to require some significant additional tax revenue. And it's certainly my view that that can only be obtained with a broad base of taxation across the general population, and of itself is simply not going to be delivered by increased taxes on what many would regard as the rich. I thought it was interesting looking at Tommaso's second slide, and I know that was to do with wealth, but the UK was well down the bottom of that chart, and I think we need to recognise that. Before I go into the detail, let me just quickly introduce myself. As Bernd has explained, I've recently completed my doctorate at Manchester University under the tutelage of Professors Julie Froud and Carol Williams. But by background, I'm a UK chartered accountant and chartered tax advisor, and have a very conventional career. I'm the CFO of a Cambridge tech company, and so on. At its heart, my research has been focused very carefully on thinking about what a fair tax system looks like with respect to income, and then also doing a considerable amount of modelling to determine how the UK measures up against that definition. And if you think about yesterday's proposed changes to national insurance, etc., really some of what I think I'm going to talk about couldn't be more relevant and pertinent to that debate. Put simply, a tax system can be categorized as progressive, flat, or regressive. A progressive one is obviously one where the tax rate increases with income. Effectively, there's a double whammy. A regressive system is one where the percentage of an individual's income that goes on tax decreases with income. And then a flat tax system is obviously one where everybody pays the same effective rate of tax. Of course, rich people pay more, but the percentage of their income that goes in tax is the same. What's interesting to me is that there appears to be a near universal acceptance that a regressive system is unfair, but legitimate debate as to how progressive or flat a system should be. But given this conclusion, to me, the really interesting point is, how does our tax system actually square up against this definition? And that's what I've spent a lot of time having a look at. I drew a lot of the inspiration for my work from a huge study by the famous French economist Thomas Piketty. And Professor Piketty charted the effective tax rate in France, where you add up all the different taxes being suffered, VAT, income tax, etc., and plotted that according to where you sit as a percentile of the French income distribution. And as you can see from this, the French system appears to be moderately progressive until about the 50th percentile, then very flat, and then starts to be significantly regressive in the long tail for the top 1% and particularly 0.1% of the French population, what one might term Piketty's winners. What my work has done is drew some inspiration from this, and I've sought to try and draw the equivalent graphs for the UK. Now, whilst the French graph ignores any fiscal benefits, the tax credit system in the UK is such a significant part of the landscape for the working poor that I thought it was also sensible to incorporate that into the modelling. And clearly the actual results depend very much on family circumstances: 2 adults, 2 children, single income earner, dual income earner, and so on. But I think probably for these purposes, let's focus on the blue line, which is a single person not in receipt of tax credits, etc. And these graphs, to me, hint at several aspects of the contemporary situation. Firstly, I think it's noteworthy for that single person that the UK graph, in basic shape, actually tracks the French graph, but you could see it's a few percentage points lower for those up to about the 90th percentile. And then actually the UK starts to exceed that for France before again having this long tail regressivity. So these graphs already suggest that the bulk of the UK population is paying notably less tax than would be the case in France. And actually that the top of the UK income distribution is paying a little bit more. Now, of course, these aren't convenient things to say. This graph also, though, hints at the additional revenue that might be available if the system wasn't regressive for the top 1% of the population, what I've labelled Area A on this graph. Now, of course, Area A might appear to be really significant, but remember, this is a sort of double logarithmic shift here on the x-axis. There aren't many people in this part of the graph, and of course, the individual savings that those people make may well be significant to them, but across the population as a whole, there aren't actually too many of them. Now, my calculations suggest that Area A for the UK is something of the order of 15 to 20 billion pounds per annum. Now, of course, this isn't a trivial sum, and fairness possibly dictates that we do something about this. But I don't think we should kid ourselves that taxing the rich of itself a little bit more is going to deliver a transformational level of government revenue. Returning to the aggregate situation, and we've seen this from some of the newspaper headlines today, actually, I think it's interesting to look at the tax take in different countries as a percentage of GDP. And I think there's some themes that come out of this. Firstly, other Western countries such as France, Germany, and the Netherlands typically raise a few percentage points more in GDP in tax than the UK does. And all of these three countries, as you can see, have seen a 3 or 4 percentage point increase over the last 20 years. As an aside, it's also interesting to note that Sweden has seen a decrease. In fact, there seems to be a bit of a convergence around 40%. And you will find the same pattern in the other Scandinavian countries as well. But it's clear from this that the UK is something of an outlier with no increase over the last 20 years, and with tax as a percentage of GDP being several points less than perhaps the nearest equivalent country in the shape of Germany. I think what's interesting from this is that you could do some very simple calculations, looking at percentages of GDP times the size of the UK economy, type that into your calculator, and you come up with a figure of 123 billion of extra tax revenue. Now, clearly, this is a transformational level of expenditure, but it's a one-time opportunity. And I think as with the increases in general taxation in the immediate post-war years and the creation of the modern welfare state, it's really important that we don't waste this and we think about very carefully about how this would be spent if we were to raise it. Now, clearly, there are many ways in which we could raise this additional tax revenue, increased income tax, VAT, perhaps new taxes, etc. And that's a discussion for another conference. But my key message here is that one needs to think very carefully about and be aware of the distribution of any additional tax revenue. And I kind of wish that the Chancellor had seen some of my graphs before he made the announcements yesterday. Let me turn now to a couple of wicked problems in relation to the contemporary tax debate, which my research has also touched upon. Firstly, Universal Basic Income, or UBI. What my work has done is to enable me to say that UBI at a full level to replace means-tested benefits could be afforded, although there would be a consequence of significant additional tax increases. And indeed, it could actually of itself bring some other benefits in terms of helping to reduce regressivity. However, I don't think UBI is a universal panacea. If you think about it, clearly the very richest would pay more to pay for it. The poorest would be broadly revenue neutral. You would set the level to enable that to be so. But the problem is that for vast swathes of the population in the middle that are currently just outside of the means-tested benefit regime, they would receive significant amounts of additional income. And I think what that means is that UBI ends up not being targeted precisely. And this one-time opportunity ends up, in my opinion, being largely wasted at the expense of other more pressing expenditure priorities. However, unfortunately, the existing means-tested benefit system, I think, is also something of a wicked problem. Due to the very high benefit clawback rates, coupled, of course, with all the other taxes that are payable, you could see here that you're going to end up with very, very high marginal tax rates for someone that's in receipt of full benefits. You could see that the marginal rates across a vast swathe of income here, their take-home pay, differs very little, even though gross pay increases significantly. And if you think about this from first principles, it all makes sense. I mean, consider someone receiving £20,000 of means-tested benefit, approximately the benefit cap. If you want to recover all of that by an income of £40,000 per annum, itself, of course, significantly more than average earnings in this country, then mathematically that requires a 50% clawback rate in addition to all the other taxes that are payable. Many people are clearly highly dependent upon such benefits, but to me, it begs the question as to what is it about our society that means that such a level of benefits are necessary, and I'll come back to that. But let me return to Germany and highlight a couple of other features of the German tax system. The table on the left expresses German taxes, including social security payments, as a percentage, this orange column here, as a percentage of the UK tax that would be payable at the same level of income. And I'm ignoring benefits here. You will note that in every case, German taxes are higher and often considerably so at lower income levels. You can also look at this in a different way. This is from the IFS on the right-hand side, comparing the taxes paid at the top of the income distribution, the 99th percentile, to the median. And again, you can see from this that the UK already taxes its highest earners proportionately much higher than other countries. This all suggests that significantly higher tax revenue requires everyone to pay more. So what do the public think about this? Well, my work touched on this a little, and 4 themes came out of this. Firstly, whilst the contemporary focus is often on inequality, I would suggest, and Tommaso has already mentioned this, that a much more fundamental issue is one of fairness. Sometimes, of course, these are the same, but other times they're very different concepts. And of course, it's a subjective concept, which makes it even more difficult, and it's perhaps impossible to measure in numbers. But I think, as with the proverbial elephant in the room, most people know fairness or unfairness when they see it. Secondly, and I've touched on this already, there's a strong and I think widely held view that a regressive tax system is unfair. And yet, as you've seen, that is exactly what we currently have. And yesterday's changes, of course, will only add to that. And thirdly, there isn't in general a desire to soak the rich in taxation. And then fourthly, I think sat upon top of all of this, there is a deep-seated skepticism about the ability of the estate, excuse me, to provide cost-efficient and effective public services. And I think many people have seen examples from that, from their own experiences. So where does that leave us? Well, significant additional tax revenue, as we've seen, could be available, but in my opinion, the reality is that this requires a broad base. Taxation on the rich is part of that. I think fairness demands that as well. But all of that needs public acceptance, and it needs to be seen to be fair, which means not adding to any existing regressivity in the tax system. You've seen some of the wicked aspects of the current tax system in terms of very high marginal tax and benefit withdrawal rates over a very wide band of income. So we need to think carefully, in my opinion, about why this is necessary and what could be done to change this. I've drawn some comparisons with Germany in this presentation, and I think it's worth just thinking about the cost of some basic services in Germany and why this higher level of taxation can be tolerated, and the difference that affordable basic services can make to the working poor. If you think about it, rents in the most expensive German city, Munich, are notably less than those in London. Berlin is rather lower. You can buy a rail card in Germany that entitles the holder to unlimited travel throughout the entire country for less than the cost of a season ticket from the outer reaches of London suburbia. And the cost of important basic services such as childcare and so on are considerably lower. Where does this take me to? Well, I think one is left with the conclusion that a combination of things like a living wage on the income side and then foundational or universal basic services, whilst having huge value in their own right, might also assist in solving the wicked problem of the tax distribution. Now, as speakers, we haven't spoken before, but I suspect this might link very nicely into what Anna is going to talk about now. So thank you.
Right, thanks a lot, Steve. Again, very interesting discussion, very interesting points. And yeah, should lead very nicely into the next presentation. So if you could stop sharing your screen, we can move on to Anna Coote, who is a principal fellow at the New Economics Foundation, whose work has focused a lot on investment in public services. And she'll be talking to us about the social guarantee, income and services to meet all our needs. So yeah, go ahead.
Hello, thank you very much for inviting me. I was so delighted to hear what Stephen had to say, because I was worried that I wasn't, my presentation isn't focused on funding the foundational economy, but what it's like and what we need to invest in. So I'm just going to share my screen. You got that? Can you hear me, please?
Yes.
Right. Can you hear me? Can you see my screen? Thank you. All right, so this is about what we call the social guarantee. And the idea is that, and again, picking up the theme about the public perceptions of fairness and how important that is for raising taxation, this is about developing a system that is based on the objective of ensuring that everyone has access to life's essentials. I'll explain what that's about. So we start with, and this diagram I think will be familiar to many of you, about meeting needs within planetary boundaries. This is the donut, Kate Raworth's wonderful work on donut economics, and we say that everyone is entitled to life's essentials today, not just today, but needs to be entitled in the future too. So what we do today needs to be done so that we can make sure we safeguard the capacity of future generations to meet that, to gain access to life's essentials. And this is what we call, or what we could be called, an essential reliance system that is both universal and sufficient. And those two concepts of universality, universalism, if you like, and sufficiency are really important to this, this idea. So here's the social guarantee. And this is what, again, picking up the theme from Stephen just now, it's about pooling resources and working together to meet all our needs. And it consists of both a living income that's made up of a real living wage, and a guaranteed minimum income, which is different from most versions of UBI. And then importantly, it foregrounds universal services. So as a form of in-kind benefit, virtual income or social wage. So these would include things like education, health and social care, housing, childcare, digital access and transport. But that's not a definitive list. It's the ones that we are focusing on in this project. And the idea is that this will enable all of us, if we do this right, to live well within planetary boundaries. And when the question is raised, of course, what are life's essentials? We draw on need theory. It's about what every individual needs in order to participate in society. And there are certain basic needs on which most need theorists seem to agree, that health and critical autonomy are essential if you want to participate in society, in order to participate in society, and they're universal across time and space. Obviously, how needs are met vary widely between locations and generations, but there are some ways of satisfying needs or meeting needs that are constant, things like water, nutrition, housing, education, and healthcare. And wherever you look in the literature and whoever you talk to in local conversations, the list is invariably includes a constant number of things that people feel are life's essentials. And our focus is on education, healthcare, housing, childcare, adult social care, transport, and access to digital information. But as I say, that's not it's not not a definitive list. Now, every one of life's essentials is different and requires a different approach in order to make sure that people get it. And we think that it's useful to think of them on a spectrum. So at the one end, we would usually rely on individual cash payments. This is a sort of, well, food is an obvious example here. And at the other end, we couldn't get life's essentials when we need them without collective action. It's essential that we have collective action through public institutions. So that's where universal services are most exclusively, if you like, collective. But if you want universal and sufficient access right across the spectrum of life's essentials, you need both. You always need collective interventions, collective measures, as well as individual payments. I'll explain a bit more about that in a minute. So this is the book that was written last year, The Case for Universal Basic Services. It explains why we think it's important to pool resources, to share risks, and to work. So we see universal services as part of the foundational economy. I do apologise to those of you who had that break. Okay, so what the social guarantee is a framework for policy and practice. It's not a silver bullet, it's not a manifesto. It's about a framework that can be applied in each area of life's essentials. So they all need a different approach, but they all have certain things in common. For a start, it should be seen as a matter of investment, not just public expenditure. So it's about valuing and building on the social infrastructure without which the formal economy would grind to a halt anyway. And we show how it can yield really substantial social, economic, and environmental benefits as a result of that investment. So it's important to think of it not just as money in, but as also returns coming back both to the economy and to society and the environment. An important part of this is that that life's essentials are a matter of universal entitlement. It isn't a concession or a privilege, it's a matter of entitlement. So everyone has a right to the services and other collective measures that meet their needs. And picking up a theme that came up also earlier about the public skepticism about the capacity of the state to provide effective services, we recognize the need for multiple models of ownership and control of the provision of life's essentials. But, and we draw this from the foundational economy, it's important that all providers share the same public interest obligations. So this is, if you like, it's described, I think, in the foundation economy as social licensing system, and we think that's important for all providers. But it isn't all about top-down state provision. We think it's important to put people in control so that decisions are grounded in democratic dialogue and that services are co-produced as far as possible at a local level. And this is all about learning from experience. We've got a lot of experience about welfare states in, right across many decades, and we can learn from their successes and their failures. There's plenty of knowledge out there that we can learn from. And this is both radical and pragmatic, because it's not about doing everything at once. It's about a framework that enables you to introduce change gradually according to the conditions that you find yourself in, whether it's a city or a country or a smaller locality. The role of government is transformed in this scenario, because although governments provide services directly where appropriate, they have these four essential functions. First of all, to ensure fair and equal access. Secondly, to set and enforce standards and obligations. Thirdly, to collect funds and to distribute them in order to achieve fairness and quality standards. and to support local control and multiple models of ownership and coordinate services across the sectors in order to get the best results. So that's the role of government, not as the sort of default provider, but as a facilitator, an enabler, and a supporter of this approach. Now I'm going to skip through these examples because I know I'm going to run out of time. But what we've done is we've looked around the world, but mainly at European countries, to see where things are done in ways that we think could show us good examples of how you can introduce the principles of social guarantee. So you can learn from Norway about childcare. There's a lot to learn from places like from Germany and Austria and Denmark on housing. I'm sorry I can't go into this in detail, but it's in the book and you can find it on our website, which I'll give you details about later. Just to pause on the example of food here, we recognize that although we would normally expect to buy food ourselves, which is why that guaranteed minimum income is a very important part of the social guarantee, along with a living wage. But we couldn't all get the quality of food that we actually need right across the country unless there was government regulation to make sure that food is produced sustainably, that it's locally produced, that the advertising doesn't gear you towards food that is not nutritious, not good for you. It has to be affordable and so on. So there's all sorts of collective action you need through government institutions to ensure that that need for food is really genuinely accessible to all. Now the gains from this approach from the social guarantee, again, I'm going to have to whiz through this, but it is essentially redistributive, because that social income that comes from public universal services is very important, particularly to low-income families. It's estimated to reduce income inequalities by about 20%. That's the public services across OECD countries. And the efficiency comes from losing the transaction costs that are associated with markets, from economies of scale, minimizing profit extraction. And if you look at the difference between the US healthcare system as it currently is and our own, you can see it's much more expensive and also has lower life expectancy. And then there's a wide range of social and environmental returns on investment and investment in the social infrastructure. It's also about building solidarity, because this is all about pooling resources and sharing risks, as I've said. And critically, it's about sustainability too. So I can't go into detail here, but quality public services can help to prevent harm, which would otherwise incur greater costs downstream as people suffered from the lack of getting life's essentials. It's a very good way of generating secure employment and helping to stabilize the economy. And critically, it's a good way, and there are several reasons for this, which I haven't got time to go into, for cutting GHG emissions and safeguarding natural resources, because it is a public and a shared endeavor and is much more amenable to sustainability than individual. It's just a collection of individual market transactions. Now, going back to the idea of the cash transfers and services, we recognize that both are essential, and it's best to see them as two sides of the same coin. You've got universal services that represent a social income. They're collectively funded. They should be sufficient and universal according to need, not means. And if you have a stronger and more secure social income, it means you require less cash income in order to meet your needs and flourish. So you need both, but they have to be mutually reinforcing, and those trade-offs matter. So there are what we're really arguing against here is that some of the advocates for universal basic income who don't think about the impact of realizing their proposals for, let's say, a sufficient basic income that gives everybody enough money to live on the capacity of governments to meet needs through collective measures, public services and other collective measures. So you need to have the calibrated so that they support each other. And in particular, you don't want to wipe out the money that we need to have more and better public services by proposing a bigger universal basic income where you're paying cash to people who don't actually need it. Now, there is a response to that, which is that, oh, well, you can always find more money. Look at what happened during the pandemic. Governments can always find more money if they want it. But to that, we would say, well, yes, if that is true, which is open to question, any additional funds that can be raised are urgently needed for climate mitigation, for green infrastructure, as well as for collective services. So you can't just go on spending more and more money without thinking about what the trade-offs are and what the money is most urgently needed to be spent on. But the cash payment that is compatible with the social guarantee with universal services is a minimum income guarantee, which is a guarantee that no one's income should fall below an agreed level of sufficiency. And that agreed level of sufficiency, we can use the sorts of methods that have been used to arrive at the minimum income standard, to agree that across the country and to agree that through democratic dialogue as well. So those two together, we think, work well. Oops, sorry, I'm just trying to get onto the next one now. So I think I've missed one out. Yeah, so just in conclusion, here we are. The social guarantee is about universal and sufficient benefits in cash and in services. They must support each other. A cash payment scheme mustn't be a barrier to more and better public services. And we see the social guarantee as central to a reimagined welfare system for a post-pandemic recovery, but also well beyond that, to boost well-being for all and to generate new employment and to stabilize the economy. And we see it as the social pillar of the Green New Deal to help to create that safe and just space for humanity that I showed you in the second slide. So that's it. Thank you. If you want to find out more about the social guarantee, there's the website and the Twitter handle. And thank you very much.
Right. Thanks a lot, Anna. Another very thought-provoking presentation. And just to say, you've all been very good about keeping time, so there's really no need to rush on your part. As I said in the introduction, we'll just do a short 5-minute comfort break at the moment to recover and get back into it. And then we'll continue with Susan's presentation. So yeah, see you in a bit. And it's been 5 minutes at this point. We can resume now. And we'll move to our last speaker, who is Susan Himmelweit, who's an economist and professor emeritus at the Open University, as well as on the management committee of the Women's Budget Group. And she has an extensive body of work revolving around themes of intra-household inequality, the economics and policy of care, and the gender implications of economic and social policy. And her talk will be, as you can see, about a care-led recovery from COVID-19, investigating in high-quality care to stimulate and rebalance the economy. So go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me. I followed a lot of the material on foundational economy, and it's very close to some of the arguments that the Women's Budget Group make. So this is a really wonderful opportunity to make this to a slightly different audience, and I'm very interested to hear what people have to say. What I want to talk about is something that we talk about as investment in social infrastructure, to talk about why we think of it as investment and why it's important to think about it that way. So I'm going to focus particularly on care services, initially both care and private, social and childcare. But if I get a chance at the end, I might just say a little bit about the recent announcement about social care. So I'm talking about a sort of subset of Anna's universal services. And some of the things I'm going to say might apply to all of them, and some of them are specific to care, and that might be something we want to discuss. And I'm also going to try and make the case that while seeing it as investment, involves a completely different way of looking at these services. So, and that the current accounting systems that we have, this idea that you tax how much you spend has to be met by taxation, isn't necessarily wrong, but it doesn't capture what some of the effects that really matter about the notion of investing in social infrastructure. So we call it social infrastructure by analogy of what people normally talk about as physical infrastructure. Social infrastructure is one where the benefits that you get over time are social, but it is investment because it's investment with future benefits. And it's infrastructure because some of those benefits are collective. Anyway, I'll get going now. It became apparent during the pandemic that a lot of people began to recognize something that as feminists we've always recognized, but became much more obvious, that both paid and unpaid care is really what our society depends on. And that using the term social infrastructure would not feel as weird now as it might have done before the pandemic. And we also had the notion of care workers being seen as particularly important, as, if you like, part of the foundational economy. But it also became clear through that the care sector in the UK was in dire need of reform, that we had lots of people, 1 in 7 older people with unmet care needs, and there are also plenty of younger people with unmet care needs. And that in only just over a majority of local authorities could parents be sure of finding the care they needed, and access to care was in general grossly uneven, and something we got mentioned earlier, potentially ruinously expensive. So that both childcare and social care is very, very expensive in this country, in this low tax country. And also that the care sector runs on low pay and insecure employment. It's largely done by women, often from ethnic minorities, many on 0 hours contract, and paid the minimum wage, or in practice less, because of the way that travelling time is not accounted for. And not surprisingly, we've had huge turnover rates and currently over 100,000 vacancies. And this is because we have a privatised and often, in fact, financialised business model that lacks any ambition in itself to provide better quality care, and that we have a cost-cutting efficiency mantra rather than a focus on what would provide services that were resilient and cooperative. So the whole ethos, if you like, in which these services are provided is one that derives from cost cutting and an efficiency that focuses on cost cutting rather than the benefits of what those services are and why they are so important, as the pandemic has shown, to the resilience of a society. And worse than that, the effects of COVID-19 and that combined with that market reliance are actually threatening both the child and social care systems we have, and therefore, of course, for women particularly, who are the backstops when the care systems don't work, this is particularly important. But we have a government that has recognised, in some sense, we need some spending to for the government's economy, for the government's recovery. But we have the Prime Minister's talked about build, build, build as the way out of the recession, and that's quite a traditional way of seeing getting out of the recession. What the Women's Budget Group proposes is, instead of build, 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 let's have care, care, care. Let's build a recovery based on our care system. And to do this, what we've shown is that a care-led recovery is not only a route to a more caring economy, which is what we think we need anyway, but actually an excellent economic stimulus. So this is what I talked about before. We want to invest in our social infrastructure to transform our broken care system. And we call it investment because spending on it now improves future well-being and will therefore reduce future need for expenditure. And it's infrastructure because it benefits not only its direct users, but the whole community. And one of the effects of that is that its full effects can't get paid for, won't get paid for and put into place if you just rely on individuals funding their own care. So care is well on the spectrum that Anna talked about of things that should be funded by individuals or collectively funded. Care is way down the collective end, or it should be anyway, and we have it in this country at the other end. So what we're arguing is for a long-term approach with the long-term benefits. So what we would call a caring economy would have a larger proportion of its workforce employed in care. They'd be employed in care and they'd be employed at better conditions of employment. And a caring economy, we'd say, is more resilient because if in a crisis care needs to take precedence, this needs to be planned for in normal times. We don't need to suddenly scrabble around and find we haven't got a care system that's up to it. We ought to have a care system that's up to it. That is purely, that just makes economic sense, if you like. So investing in care, we talk about it as investment, but it is not one-off spending. When people talk about investment, they often talk about, building a bridge, building a road. It's one-off spending that has long-term effects. What we're saying is that a large part of what's talked about as recurrent spending, like spending on care, is still investment, but we have a national accounting system in which things are either capital spending and therefore one-off type things, or recurrent spending, which is, or what's counted as current spending, and therefore not seen as investment in national accounts. And therefore, that type of investment is underprovided relative to that one-off spending that physical infrastructure tends to be. But we'd also argue that, in fact, this recurrent type of spending, the spending on social care, is actually a better stimulus than investing in physical infrastructure. Because it creates more jobs, and I'll show you this in a moment. But it not only creates jobs, it actually also creates the workforce to go into those jobs, because there are lots of people who are not in employment now or are doing reduced hours because of the demands of unpaid care that they're doing. And finally, that we'd argue that it also actually recoups more revenue through increasing employment and therefore the taxes that people pay than investing in physical infrastructure. So investing in care is further, it's also sustainable because its stimulus effects don't depend on there being spare capacity, because it not only increases the demand for labor, it also increases the supply. It's sustainable because it doesn't exacerbate existing gender inequalities. And that's very important because the gender norms we have about who does unpaid care and the willingness of women to do a large amount of unpaid care might well depend on our existing gender inequalities. And if we make them worse, we don't know what will happen. If we make them better, we don't know what will happen. It'd be much better to run a society that doesn't depend on those gender inequalities. So the movement that we're suggesting is in tune with the direction in which gender and care norms are changing, that people are becoming more prepared to use professionalized care, more dependent on professionalized care too, and less inclined to see it as purely a woman's responsibility. And finally, it's sustainable because it's consistent with the transition to a lower carbon economy. Care work is low carbon work. It's a low emissions type of employment. So let's have a look at the, oops. That's it. I can't see my full screen because I'm seeing all the rest of you. Oh, I can push it down. So what we've looked at is two scenarios. One is to create enough spending to have the same proportion of people employed in care in this country as in Denmark. So we're saying if we had a caring society in which therefore a larger number of people employed in care, first of all, what would it cost? And we've taking account of the revenue gains from that, through extra people paying taxes, the employment generated not only by spending in the care industry itself, but also the effects on industries that supply the care industry, and also the effects of the extra spending of the wages of people newly employed. And as I said before, I think for investing in care, those people are likely to be new employees, or a large proportion of that. And you can see that our calculation is that you'd need to spend 1.9% of GDP, but you would create 2 million jobs. If we use existing ratios of gender ratios in each industry, this would be approximately 3/4 of which would go to women, and they would largely be in the care sector itself, but the jobs generated outside the care sector would not necessarily only be for women. And but if you spent the same net amount on construction, you can see you'd create far fewer jobs, the gender balance would be quite different, and in fact you'd even produce more jobs for men by investing in care than you would by investing in construction. The graph on the right is if you not only invested in care, but also gave care workers a 45% wage rise. So this is to raise them to the same level as they would be in Denmark as a proportion of average wages. And we would produce more jobs because there would be more spending power. But it would cost 2.7% of GDP, nets 2.7% of GDP invested. Again, far more jobs than the equivalent investment in construction. And these graphs show you that this particular effect is not only true of the UK, it's true of a number of different economies, that investing in care is just a better way of producing jobs, a better stimulus for the economy than investing in construction. So we'd argue that a care-led recovery would transform the services for those who need them, and that includes not only the direct care users, but also the unpaid, the opportunities for unpaid carers. They might want to continue caring, but they might want to be able to combine it more easily with other activities. It would generate more employment than investment in construction, reduce the gender employment gap, unlike investment in construction that increases, but it would still create a lot of jobs for men and basically contribute to better well-being, a healthier, better educated, more productive population, and therefore preventing greater needs in the future. And this is actually the core of what we mean by investment, but I haven't been able to factor that in anything I've said. So on top of that, we have the benefits of the future and help create a greener and more resilient, more caring economy. Now, how am I doing for time?
You have about another minute. I'm
going to very quickly then say something about what we heard yesterday. This is for people in England. I'm sorry if the people who are not there. We had, as other people said, a big care announcement. The main thing I want to say is that what we've said is just, what we've heard is just literally not enough. That if we really want to think about transforming our care system, we've worked out that it requires an annual 44 billion pounds invested in it. So 28 billion more than the current 17 billion, just in the short term, to have a universal care system in which the criteria that are currently legal but are not met are actually met, and improving working conditions, not a great deal, but enough to make sure that everybody in the sector gets a real living wage. That would cost 28 billion more than the current 17 billion. And then we move towards a much better system that met more needs and improved training and gave pay in line with that, like in the graphs that I showed before, that would cost an additional 30 billion annually. And so that would bring UK spending on social care in line with that in Sweden and Norway as a share of GDP. And that would stimulate the economy to generate over 1 million jobs, again, many of which will be filled by people previously unable to take employment. And 28% of that increase would actually be covered by increased revenue. But instead, we've got a government proposed spending only 14 billion a year to produce a system that remains means tested, will not be implemented effectively in social care until 2025. And even then, spending an amount that's not sufficient even to reverse cuts since 2010. And basically meaning that many will still go without the care they need, and leaving little or no scope for improving the care system itself. Anyway, thank you very much.
Right, thanks a lot, Susan. Very, very insightful, very thought-provoking. Yeah, so this is where we would then start moving into questions and debate. So, like I said, if you have any question, if you have any comment, raise your hand in the Zoom function or write something into the chat, and then we, yeah, then I would pick on you. Does anyone have any questions? I see that Jerome has actually written something into the chat.
I was just thinking, Bernd, shall I address that question?
Sure, go ahead.
I think it's an interesting one, and perhaps links back to Tommaso's slides and perhaps the core of what I was saying as well. Let me just find that that slide, which I have done, and share my screen with you again, if I may. This one here. So hopefully you can now see the screen. Does that work?
Yep.
Good. I think the question that Jerome raised was because I was making the point that the UK taxes high income earners compared to the median much more highly than other countries. And I think the point that Jerome made was, well, okay, is that simply because income inequality is higher in the UK and therefore inevitably the top 1% are earning more income in the UK, say compared to Germany, and therefore pay more tax? And no doubt there is an element of truth in that. And I'll just say two things. Firstly, of course, the Gini coefficient between the UK and Germany is not that different for income. The UK is higher. And I think going back to the slide that Tommaso presented at the start, and I know that was to do with wealth, again, you could see that the UK was well down there. What I would point out, though, is on this IFS graph, the grey triangle actually relates to top, which they define as being 10 times median income. So, of course, that bears no resemblance to income distributions and the fact that maybe we have more very highly paid people. It's just looking at hypothetical calculations. And you could see that if you look at that and look at the triangle, then the UK tax system on a hypothetical income of 10 times the median is rather higher than Germany's. So again, I think it sort of inconvenient truth, I suppose. It dispels this myth a little bit that somehow the UK is more gentle on the highest earners compared to other countries, at least. But my point, of course, is that fairness dictates that that area that I've labelled A on my graphs, we should do something about. But we're not sort of out of kilter with lots of other countries.
All right, thanks for that, Susan. Now I'm actually seeing some hands up, so yeah, let's start with Ian.
Thank you, first of all, to all four speakers. They were brilliant presentations, really stimulating. I just wonder if I can be a bit greedy. Can I ask about consumption corridors? I mean, I think Anna put a really good argument in place for the minimum universal basic services. Are there problems policy issues in terms of setting the maximum in a consumption corridor. And then to Susan, I totally agree with your analysis, Susan. I just wonder whether you had thoughts, given what's happened in the last 48 hours, whether because there are differences within the devolved United Kingdom, whether there's room for manoeuvre in places like Wales and Scotland to move towards policies that are closer to what you're suggesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Should we collect a few more before we get back? Right. Then let's continue with Julie.
Thanks, Bernd. Yes, really compelling arguments from all four speakers. So thank you very much for that, and some really nice connections between them. And I think if we join the dots, then what we have collectively is, we need more tax revenues. We need to raise these in a more progressive way, and we need to use the funds, for investment in services. I think that's the kind of, in simple terms. And all of that is technically possible, but obviously the big obstacles are political, and it seems that there is a kind of one aspect of the political obstacle are the politicians, and we saw yesterday in the UK, a very poor attempt at solving this puzzle. But we also have this obstacle about sort of public attitudes and the citizenry who will be the beneficiaries of this investment, and this was mentioned earlier. So I just wondered if the speakers had any views about how do we solve this political conundrum about, how do we get both politicians and citizens to see that this joining of the dots would lead to a better outcome.
All right, thanks, Julie. Then Colin has his hand up, and then we can get back to the speakers. Colin?
Yeah. I think my question really relates to how might our perspectives on redistribution in terms of tax play out if the unit of analysis shifts from individuals to households, in terms of whether or not we operate in a progressive or regressive system as a result. And then also, who would, in a sense, be funding the FE in terms of benefits in kind and benefits in cash within a household distribution perspective? It seems to me it would probably be the top quintile group of households who account for 65% of direct taxes, and the burden would fall on that group of households. But it changes the perspective away from individuals to households. And then we can capture, as it were, the household as a beneficiary of both cash benefits and non-cash benefits.
Okay, thanks, Colin. I think there were questions in there for every speaker. So yeah, let's just go through the order as we talked before. So yeah, Tommaso.
I think so. Thank you for the questions. I'd quite like to answer the one about public perception. I think that points to part of the presentation, but what we've seen also in the other presentation. I think there is an opportunity now as a result of COVID, where the general public is more aware of the role of the state and the role of providing benefit. I think Stephen made it clear in presentation. Perhaps in the past there was also a sense that what we're paying for, we're not getting good services, and therefore those that advocated for lower state, more private intervention, that kind of was one of the argument. I think now the COVID has changed this slightly, and so both on the role of the state, but also on the importance of healthcare and providing social services. And so I think that there is this opportunity or perhaps a sweet spot where the public understand that they want more state intervention, and also to services to be provided. I mean, just the last 48 hours, right-wing think tanks were still arguing that social care should be simply left to the private. So in a way, yes, we could have got a much more progressive way to pay for this: wealth taxation, capital gains, taxing capital gains the same way with tax income tax rate, they'll could generate billions of revenues. But at the same time, there was also those that said, no, actually, the state should not be doing anything. I think we are in a different position now where we can still push for progressive taxation and at the same time try to explain why social care services and healthcare provision is important and funding should be attributed to this. And I think this, this comparison that was just made by Susan on infrastructure versus social provisional social healthcare in terms of creating jobs. This is something that was not really in the media until COVID. So now, this has changed. And so this is in the war of ideas, as I mentioned before, there are good arguments to be able to get the public to support this. And the public is generally supportive both of this type of provision by the state. They're generally supportive of higher, more progressive taxation. The question is that, then they don't just vote on this. So these are not things that the general public will vote on specifically and choose a specific political party just on those bases. But there is general support for this, and I think this will also something that will come up at the next general election. I think so. Politicians in power, they will have to take this into account.
Right. Thanks, Tommaso. Stephen, want to continue?
Mute myself. Yeah, let me just say a couple of things, Bernd. I think in terms of the first question, and this came out of my research, and I think you see it generally in the media these days as well, that people just want more honesty and openness. I mean, I detect a sort of theme the last few weeks in terms of increasingly people being fed up with politicians behaving one way and saying something completely different. And I'd like to think what I've tried to do with my work and my graphs, you can have legitimately different views on how progressive you think a tax system should be, or indeed whether it should even be flat. And as I say, I think the evidence is that everyone regards regressive as being unfair, but the rest and the steepness of that curve, I think, is up for debate. And what I've tried to do with my research is draw the picture, try and be a little bit apolitical with respect to it, and use that as a tool to illuminate the debate wherever you happen to be. So somehow trying to get that sort of openness and clarity of communication and presentation out there. I think that's the first point. The second point, I mean, I think the household compared to individual issue is obviously vitally important. As you saw with those different curves, yes, household composition and so on matters enormously at the lower end of the income spectrum. Actually, by the time you get to that far right end of the curve, the top 1%, etc., that long tail regressivity and the basic pattern of the curve, and indeed the numbers, doesn't really matter whether you're looking at it at an individual or a household level. I think that long tail regressivity remains, and the numbers are broadly the same as well. But to me, it's openness, honesty, and clarity of messaging and communication. Picture's worth 1,000 words, etc. In terms of trying, how many people are going to look at yesterday's announcement, for example, and the distribution of it, and what does that mean? What does that do to regressivity? Yes, there's headlines about, oh, this will not help progressivity, but it needs to go a step beyond that to really bring it to life and influence party politics and policy decisions.
All right, thanks, Steve. Yeah, Anna, go ahead.
Yes, well, let me start with the question about consumption corridors, which is really another way at looking at that safe and just space for humanity that was in the first slide that is in the Cape Raworth donut. And the question, I think, was a good one, is can the framework of the social guarantee help to deal with the ceiling, the necessary ceiling of the space that we have to occupy, the upper level of the consumption corridor, as well as making sure we have secure foundations. And I think there are, the main way is that if you have a needs-based approach to working out how we're going to live our lives together, and starting with the notion of life's essentials, you're talking about sufficiency. You're not talking about what we want and how everyone can have what they want. You're talking about what everybody can have what they need, and that is an inherent in the notion of basic human needs is the idea of sufficiency. So that's one way in which it helps to bring aspirations down, or to focus aspirations between the upper and the lower ceiling. But I think that the point is well made that, you know, we do need to look at other things that we can do to keep consumption within that underneath that ceiling. And there is some work on this, which we can talk to you about separately. I haven't got the links with me now, but I have put on the chat a link to this special issue on consumption corridors, which has got a chapter on UBS at the end, but it's also got lots of other interesting things on consumption corridors, which I hope you'll find useful. And when I'm not going to deal with the question of households. I think it's a very interesting one, and I'd like to see, you know, how that would, what that would produce to look at it through households, not individuals. I think that's quite important. But on the political thing, I think if you start with asking people what they need and addressing what, you know, access to life's essentials, this is inherently fair because everybody agrees across that spectrum of needs. And so there is something that's in the social guarantee that's about putting down a starting point, if you like, for how we envisage the way we're going to live together that is essentially fair. And I think that it does resonate with people. And I think that's one way, not the way, it is one way of appealing to people, not just to say, hey, we're going to give you lots of money. We're going to say, this is a system that will enable you to have what you need, what everybody needs. And I think that helps to establish a political rapport. I could be wrong, but that's what we hope is the case.
All right, thanks a lot, Anna. And yeah, Susan.
Well, I was asked a particular question about Wales and Scotland. They do have different care systems, and to some extent they've shown what's possible. They're both very limited differences. In Wales in particular, because Wales doesn't have any tax raising powers, and Scotland has chosen not to use them very much. They've made their tax system their income tax system a little bit more progressive than the British one. Sorry, the UK one, the English one. So I think there is that. But I do think that the difference in the systems probably reflects much more a political difference, and that both Scotland and Wales have signed up to be well-being economies and are recognizing that the care, the level of social care, for example, is part of what constitutes well-being. So I think that the fact that we have devolved administrations is very useful because it shows what else is possible. I'm not sure, given the overall discourse on tax, whether one can expect huge differences. And in a way, I think that that's the thing that we really need to work on. That the notion that we currently have that individual consumption is good and tax is bad, that we should be trying to change that discourse to talking about tax contributions, and that basically some things are better provided individually, some things are better provided collectively. And I would suggest one thing that politicians who want to make a case similar to the sort that we want to make, they should start counting as part of the people's standard of living. When they produce graphs talking about standard of living, they should count in that the level of public services. Because when you talk about the level of the inequality, for example, in England and Germany not being very different, if you took account of public services, the Gini coefficients would be rather different, I believe. I haven't done this, but I would suspect it is if you are in a society with better public services that reach everyone and are often particularly used by those with lower incomes, your picture of how much inequality there is. And so in the UK, we have a particularly high level of inequality because so much less is provided collectively. And I think that that's a potentially easy point to make, and that politicians of the left should be making that. But I agree very strongly with what Stephen said about honesty and the clarity of the message being so important. But that's one of the things I would include in that message.
All right, thanks a lot, Susan. Yeah, we still have a lot of time, so please go ahead if you have any additional questions or comments. Until then, I actually have a few questions myself, and we'll just throw those in right now. Question, I guess, for both Tommaso and Stephen. Very basically, whenever we talk about raising taxes, there's the threat of capital flight. So I was just wondering how severe you think that threat is in relation to more progressive taxation, and what can be done to tackle it. Then to Anna, I was wondering, the way I understand the concepts you're describing, you're suggesting a combination of individual provision with universal guarantees through the public sector. So I was kind of wondering where you see the role of the third sector, nonprofit sector. Like, does that sector sort of vanish and become absorbed into the public or the private, or is it still there in your notion? And then for Susan, you talked mainly about how greater investment can boost employment and labor conditions in the care system. But I'm very glad you also mentioned the implications for accessibility and availability of care services. So, but you mentioned it at the end, so I was kind of wondering if you can elaborate on that a bit, like what the implications would be for this enhanced investment, especially also because your comparison to Denmark, I think that can be a bit tricky, because Denmark, it does obviously have a relatively well-financed social infrastructure, but access is also very strongly tied to citizenship and becomes increasingly so, I think, in the past couple of years. So, which makes it very exclusive to migrants or to certain groups of migrants. So I was kind of wondering what your thoughts were on what is necessary to avoid replicating that. Yeah. And yeah, maybe
Thank you, Ben. I'll go first on your question on is if we increase taxes on the top 1% or top 0.1%, that they all want to leave the country. I think there is little or reliable empirical analysis of what will happen. Last year we had the UK Wealth Tax Commission, which was put together from a number of academics from the LSE and Warwick, and in their view, if you were to apply a one-off levy, this will be difficult to evade. But at the same time, there is the risk if you try and, for example, increase capital gain taxes, that some investors might decide to move away. But ultimately, first tax is only one of the factors that affect investment decisions, and people want to live in the UK for various reasons, not just for the tax rate. Even like the top 0.1%. There's also the kind of the clear impact on revenue, but also the impact on the fairness of the system, on the social contract. So, can we afford a system where a small part of the population is effectively taxed less than some whose income is significantly lower, and that is kind of there should be a fundamental part of our foundation economy to address that. So I think it is something that needs to be considered. I just wanted to add something to what Stephen said. I think the fact that it is clear that taxes cannot just rise for the 0.01%, and I think we saw that in the last 48 hours. There is taxes will increase to pay for for public services, and I think that's important that that's done in a progressive way. But at the same time, everybody will have to contribute. So the argument that only the 0.1% are going to provide all the services that we want is a spurious argument.
Thanks, Tommaso. And yeah, Stephen, want to continue?
Sure, thank you. I mean, I think I would sort of broadly echo that, but actually, I mean, obviously, by background, I am not an economist. I don't think I'm particularly qualified to say what would happen in terms of capital flight, etc. But I have a gut feel that fears of that are probably somewhat overstated. I think if you look at hedge funds and so on, you don't see many of them decamping permanently to Switzerland. There are many advantages of being in London and the UK and so on. In terms of my own work, one of the things that I touched on a little bit as well, it's interesting to speculate where the peak of the Laffer curve is, for example. And of course, nobody knows, but everything that I have read suggests that that peak is rather higher than current aggregate tax rates. So I suspect that putting all of that into the mix within the bounds of reasonable possibility, the risk of what you described is probably somewhat overstated.
All right, thanks, Stephen. And yeah, Anna.
Yes, thank you. You asked about the third sector, basically, and we do make it very clear. I perhaps didn't have a chance to, or didn't make it clear enough today, that it isn't just there's not just a straightforward dichotomy between things that are provided individually and things that are provided by the state. And across the range of life's essentials, there is a strong role for other kinds of organizations as providers of the things that will enable people to get those essentials. So these can include community groups, charities, and all sorts of organizations, social enterprises, mutually owned outfits, and so on. So we recognize, as does this is quite important, I think, in the thinking behind the foundational economy, that we're not just talking about the state doing everything, but we are talking about all the providers being obliged to follow the same set of public interest obligations. So that's really the important thing, and that's it's one way in which we're trying to learn from what we have done so far in terms of the post-war welfare system, that although third sector organizations and charities have played quite an important role, the focus of public attention has been, especially largely as the governments have tried to reduce reduce the welfare state, to cut it back, is to say, well, the state is not good at this, it can't do it. Well, and in many ways, it does have a bit of a record of disempowering people and imposing kind of uniform solutions. So what we want is to learn from that, to make sure that people are in control of the ways in which their needs are met locally, and that there's a range of different organizations, and the role of the state is to coordinate, to support, to encourage, to distribute funds, to make sure that a range of organizations can play a part in a way that gets the best outcomes. And if I can just say something about this idea of flight and division that might be generated by trying to introduce a different kind of system. And I think central to the idea of a social guarantee, as is in a way central to the idea of everything that Sue has been talking about, is the idea of solidarity. And there's a political project there about trying to find ways of engaging the general public in discussions about why it matters that we are all in this together. Now, many of you will remember that phrase used, I think, by David Cameron, but there is something to be done to reclaim the collective ideal and to get people interested in how everyone benefits, not just because of the services that they will receive, but because of the impact on society as a whole of other people receiving services, and how that if everybody is doing well, then everybody benefits. So that's part of the political project. I can't begin to pretend that we have got that sorted, but it is something that we must all do.
Right. Thanks, Anna. Yeah, sorry for misunderstanding you there. That makes total sense what you said. All right. Yeah, Susan.
You asked me about access. Well, that's a very important part of the model that the Women's Budget Group, our demand for much greater funding on social care is for a universal system, so that is non-means tested system. So, and we think that not having means testing is important for two reasons, both of which I think relate to some of the things we've talked about here. One is to do with fairness. There are different notions of fairness. It's not just fairness over the income distribution, but there's also fairness between people who have have care needs and people who don't. And even if you're better off, it seems a lot of people think it's unfair that you have to pay a vast amount of money for social care. And so our solution to that is not to have a means test, and that's what they've been trying in Scotland, though perhaps not funding it sufficiently for it to work properly. But the other reason for talking about, for making something not means tested, to have a universal access, is the other reasons that Anna talked about, to see it as something that is collectively provided, that we all benefit from, not just individually, but collectively, that we benefit as a collectivity from having an NHS. And I think nobody would doubt that, but we would also benefit as a collectivity from having a system that ensured that everybody was cared for properly, and possibly for some other services too. But the collective benefit is both that you know that you can use it, you know that other people can use it, but also some sense of responsibility for its existence, that you have a stake in that system, and that seems to me very important. It's also for care services it's very important not to make means tested, because if you do, there will still be people who don't get them, because there will be people who decide that they don't want their children to lose out from the amount of money they've spent on their own care, all sorts of reasons. People don't pay for care if they have to pay for it when they really need it. And so that's another good reason for having a non-means tested universal access. I wouldn't hold up Denmark as my model for society in all respects, and I would certainly have it without the racism if I wanted to import a Danish model. I actually, there are all sorts of theories about the development of the welfare state, which link racism, lack of ethnic diversity, to why Scandinavian countries developed their good welfare states. So this is not a simple question, but in terms of access, so we've always talked about access for residents, basically. It's not to do with citizenship or immigration status. Okay.
Right, thanks, Susan. Sounds great. I see another hands up by Julia. So, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Bernd. Thank you to all the speakers for absolutely excellent and inspiring presentations. It's been a great event so far. I have a couple of questions to each of the speakers. I did and do work on energy and green economy, and more recently more on social reproduction and post-Soviet space. So my questions will be informed by that. Anna, I wanted to ask you something about the sustainable consumption corridors. We wanted to invite you to comment a little bit more on what kind of dimension and what role do you assign to the international dimension of production and consumption towards meeting different basic needs of society? Specifically, I'm interested in relocalizing of certain forms of supply, especially in provision of social guarantees in various societies, because of course, in EU as this kind of bastion of greening and the rest of it, by production of emissions is doing quite less so well in terms of consumption of emissions. So to me, that kind of question is very interesting, the international dimension of the dynamics that you were talking about in terms of sustainable consumption corridors specifically. And I've written on that. I'm really interested to hear what you have to say. A question about taxes is something quite similar in terms of localizing of certain policy decisions, if you like, because a lot of what we've heard today is talking about forms of taxation that predominantly rest within the domestic domain, but of course, taxation, there are a lot of international loopholes and agreements and tax havens, not least in and around the UK. So what kind of spanner in the works does that throw when you're trying to design models about taxation? That is to the first two papers, of course. And then there is another thing I want to ask about social production to Anna and Sue. It's about the pooling of resources and building up the care infrastructure and social security. So I'll be talking tomorrow about what the erosion of that did to post-Soviet states and what kind of what destruction that brought with it, because it was sort of the build-up that you are suggesting, but in reverse. So like a lot of scaffolding was removed, and then things went down south very quickly. So I really emphasize, Sue and what you were talking about. So I would invite you to comment a little bit more what you were suggesting about social securities and pooling of social care and other care infrastructure, and why is it not on the COP agenda as far as it should be, and why is it not part of the green jobs agenda? Because care work is by definition localized. You cannot outsource it very easily. You can use migrant labor, but you cannot use a nanny on Zoom from China permanently to look after your baby, for example. And I think care work and social security should be much more of a much higher on the agenda of green jobs, much higher on the sustainable development agenda, much higher on the COP26 agenda. But then, of course, if you look at the UN initiatives and their sustainable development goals, social dimension of sustainability is always a bit of an afterthought still. Like it is there, but it's kind of also ironic and also gendered in its own way that humans who are designing sustainable goals for humans care about humans least. But then again, it makes you wonder, who are those humans and who is doing their work for them at home, perhaps for free or on cheap. So those are sort of like some thoughts that I had about these excellent papers, and apologies if it wasn't very systematized, but that's me excited about what I've heard this morning. Thank you very much.
Right, thanks a lot, Julia. Very, very thought-provoking thoughts there. So can have another round of talks, and looking at the time, I think it makes sense if you treat those also as sort of your concluding statements, if you like. And Stephen, you wrote to me that you actually had another point you wanted to raise, so why don't we start with you this time?
Sure, let me do that, Bernd, thank you. And possibly it sort of links into what we've just been talking about in terms of last week's changes, yesterday's changes as well in terms of NI rates, etc. And Julia mentioned tax havens and so on. I suppose the main plank of my presentation is that a lot of the things that get spoken about in the media are important. Fairness dictates that we do something about it. One could talk about recent corporate tax changes in terms of tax bases and so on. But I just have a feeling that some of that is a bit of a distraction, and that there's a much bigger picture, an unspoken picture that gets talked about. Changes in terms of taxing at a minimum rate 15%, profits in excess of 10%. It starts to be lost in the roundings of national accounts. Point I was going to mention, it links back into this social care point. It links back into the need for honesty and so on. And this is a massive political hot potato in terms of a potential pot of taxation gold, is the whole issue of inheritance and death taxes. And if you think back in time, the death tax, the dementia tax has not done either major party any good in elections the last few years. And yet, if you think about it, and I think about it from a fairness perspective, that to me starts to be quite interesting. Inheritance tax raises literally only a few £billion a year in this country. Think of national wealth, 10 trillion. Divide that by a 30-year generational lifespan, if you like, and that's 333 billion of transfers a year, and yet we raise only 5-ish billion of inheritance tax. Not surprisingly, again, it's this broad base, the fact that for most couples, the first £1 million of their estate is tax-free. And there's a huge pot of gold there. And I think fairness dictates that we start to try and slay some of those sacred cows, if you like. And actually, it links back into issues such as generational fairness. Think about the effect on house prices of those that have had big inheritances that can afford to pay and so on. So I think my plea overall is we need to think about the big picture and be prepared to have some of these very inconvenient and uncomfortable conversations.
All right, thanks, Stephen. Yeah, Tommaso, want to continue?
Yes, thank you, Yulia. I think what you ask is actually very pertinent in terms of the world that we're going to be living in and the challenges we're going to have. And on one hand, tax avoidance by multinationals is one of the toxic aspects of globalization, and some of the international community, the G20 is trying to grasp with this challenge, and we might get to a minimum tax, a global minimum tax, or more than 15% or 15%. The US are pushing for 21%, and this is something again is down to the national politics and how the different the war ideas and the lobbying to get this water down any real reform. But what Stephen will say, we'll get even more into that when we talk about funding climate change. And we saw the yellow vest in France. Carbon tax is kind of the new big thing, but that means increased costs, and who's gonna pay for those additional taxes, and the social, and if the additional taxes are perceived to be unfair, this will lead to social unrest. So I think there is the need to look at the bigger picture and to find money where there is where there are, but at the same time the issue of is this a fair deal, and is everybody on the same boat? Are we all in this together? This is an issue of fairness, and this is why a sense of progressivity, where those that have the bigger shoulder bear a higher cost, seems fair.
Thanks a lot, Tommaso. And yeah, Anna.
Right, I'm sorry I dropped out again for reasons beyond my control. Sue was in the middle of saying something really interesting, and I'm afraid I missed the last bit of it, but I agree with everything you've said so far, Sue. So I only picked up when it came to Yulia's question. I heard you talk about consumption corridors. I hope it's enough just to refer you to that special edition of the journal, which I put in the chat line. But to say, again, to underline the point that we need not only to be addressing the questions of taxation and services, but also about excessive consumption and how we make sure that we can not only collectively identify what is excessive, but then introduce measures that will make it either very difficult or impossible to consume things that are way beyond what we need. So luxuries, excessive consumption, to understand that there's a ceiling, and this is particularly for environmental reasons, that we have to do this, and we have to do this fast, and it's a necessary part of the picture. And I think that the framework that is offered by the social guarantee helps to put that into a perspective that will enable people to say, yes, it's fair, and I still get access to life's essentials, and so does everyone else, and therefore it is legitimate to address the issue of excessive individual consumptions. And you asked also about why aren't these measures in part of the thinking around COP and the Green New Deal? Well, I do know that we've been having discussions with the people who are putting forward the Green Transition Bill in the UK Parliament, Caroline Lucas and Clive Lewis, and we had a conversation with them. We said, well, look, here's the social guarantee. This is what it's about. We think this should be part of, this should be seen as the social pillar. And they've gone away and they've adjusted it, and it's now come back to us, and it's got the social dimension in it pretty strongly. So that's something. And in a way, maybe it's just people don't realize how important this is. And maybe it is about making sure we have conversations with the right people about the essential nature of bringing together pro-environmental and pro-human security, social thinking. And you can create a virtuous circle that way. Otherwise, you know, a lot of people are just going to be not interested in these in the COP, in measures that we need to do for the climate, because they think they're left behind and left out, and it's got nothing to do with them. So it's not just a nice to have, in my view, it's really essential. And the social guarantee offers a way of doing this because it's about needs, and therefore it's about sufficiency and not excess, and because it's about public endeavor, both through service provision, but also through this idea of public interest obligations for service providers, which can include an obligation to run your business and run whatever it is, the outfit that you're running, in ways that are absolutely compatible with the measures we need to take on climate and on the natural environment. So the social licensing, if you like, and I'm talking here to the foundational economy people, or the public interest obligations that we've been talking about, that's where you can bring people together to work in the same way for environmental benefit as well as social.
Right, thanks a lot, Anna. Great points. And finally, Susan.
Well, care work as part of the Green New Deal. I've spent a lot of time over the past year or so talking to Green New Deal people, trying to make this point that they should include care work in what they see as that an increase in care jobs is actually a movement to a more caring economy, but that more caring economy is also greener. And every time I've presented it, the people say, oh yes, that's really interesting. They agree with it, and then they seem to forget about it next time they write their next report. But actually, it's just about beginning to change. And you are getting more people talking about having good public services as part of what a Green New Deal needs. I think we have more work to do on this, keeping people honest, if you like, on this. But I think the moment is coming. Whether it's coming with the general public, I don't know, and that's a much more difficult thing to say. But I do also think it's a good way of selling a Green New Deal, you know, with the general public. At least I hope so. I've got one other comment I'd like to make about the whole thing, which I think it's very important to recognise that fairness isn't just one thing. That if we're going to adopt the notion of a fair system, a fair this, a fair that there isn't a single measure of fairness. And I think the recent discussion about social care funding was an example of this, and it was something that we had put forward proposals for much greater spending and new systems were fearful of, which is that the whole debate got hijacked by the idea of, was the method of funding, the taxation system, a fair one? And the issue about have we got a reasonable social care system seemed to get lost. So when people talk about debating social care, what they tended to mean was debating different ways of funding it, not about what do we need for a good social care system. So it's all very well to say that using national insurance is not a fair way to fund it. I would agree with that. But there's also the issue of the people who are not getting social care are not being treated fairly. And they need to go into that equation too. They won't show up if you're just looking on income figures, household income figures. There are other measures we need besides, income inequality to assess fairness. And I think people are that is something that is accepted by people. So the talking about the dementia tax was not about which income bracket is that going to fall on. It was that the system that we had was effectively a tax on some group that it was unfair to tax. And I think we have to take that in. And it's right too. We do have to think about fairness along a number of dimensions. So, and certainly not just household income. It's very important also what happens within households in terms of fairness.
All right, thanks a lot, Susan. Thanks a lot, everyone, for your great conclusions, and thanks a lot for your fantastic presentations and really, really insightful debates. Yeah, I would also like to thank the other organizers. I would like to thank Jane for helping run this thing, and yeah, I would like to encourage everyone to come back to us at 2 p.m. for our next session, which will be around national projects and the foundational economy. So yeah, looking forward to seeing you all there again.